Welcome to Cambridge Forum with architect Peter Smith, urban planner Larissa Brown, and urban policy specialist Kristina Egan, discussing the vital topic of green cities. Sprawl, ever longer commutes, dying urban cores. How can we create urban communities that are environmentally and economically sustainable? Our panel tonight is here to discuss this question and two current initiatives, transit-oriented design and smart growth, that are being used by planners to build green cities, the green cities of the future. First, we'll hear from Peter Smith, who will introduce the topic in greater detail. Peter Smith is the principal of Global Urban Solutions. He's worked as a licensed architect, urban designer, and planner in the Boston area for 30 years. A member of the faculty of the Boston Architectural Center, he has authored publications and organized conferences on urban sustainability. Welcome to Cambridge Forum, Peter Smith.
Thank you very much. Good evening. Green cities are designed to save the environment. How can we preserve the natural environment and have a better quality of life for everyone in the future? Some experts say this can be done using the principles of smart growth and transit-oriented development. These people envision a future where most of us can walk to work, to schools, libraries, stores, and the post office. If our workplace is not near where we want to live, we can take safe, clean public transit in this ideal futuristic community. Actually, these communities already exist. We will tell you how they work. Smart growth is about answering three questions. Where do we want to grow? How do we want to grow? How much do we want to grow? It is about preserving our environment, enhancing our quality of life, and supporting our economic competitiveness and distributing the benefits and burdens of development more fairly. The members of the Massachusetts Smart Growth Alliance share a common vision of Massachusetts, a state that is healthy, diverse, and prosperous, and has prosperous communities, working landscapes, and critical environmental resources protected from development. It has urban reinvestment and community development, transportation and housing choice and affordability, and regional equity and opportunity. So, where do we see indicators of this smart growth? And where do we see green cities? Well, we can see it in the National Green Communities Initiative, a 5-year, $555 million effort to build more than 8,500 affordable, environmental-friendly homes nationwide. Maverick Landing in East Boston is an example of what can be done. It has energy-efficient homes, low-flow toilets, broad windows that draw in natural light, construction materials made of recycled wood, wind-powered generators, solar panels, and Energy Star appliances. We can also see green cities in Washington, D.C., where 40% of development is within walking distance of transit. We see developers taking advantage of increasing demand from young and old, single and married, gay and straight, white and black, with and without children, for a new generation of urban living with lively main streets, higher densities that mix many different types of housing, greater economic and social diversity, new parks, reinvigorated schools, and other qualities that will make cities more livable. This is happening right now in cities around the country. We see green cities where shared car services, like Zipcar, which is happening not only in Cambridge, but in various other cities across the country, provide convenient short-term personal auto use, allowing urban dwellers to eliminate the hassle of owning and maintaining their own separate vehicle. All of these indicators and more are attracting people to most cities in the U.S. where they can take whatever they can take, where they can take advantage of these diverse cultural, entertainment, and employment opportunities that are found in population-dense areas. Now, Kristina Egan is going to share with us current trends in smart growth, and she is very experienced in that, being the executive director of the Smart Growth Alliance here in Massachusetts. Kristina?
Thank you, Peter. I see the question before us at today's forum as what kind of cities are we living in now, and how is it that we got here? And what are the cities that we are building for the future, and particularly for future generations? So that we're all on the same page, I'll start with a definition of what I define as smart growth, which is broadly defined as including green cities and also preserving open space and other areas of natural value. Smart growth development is development that limits outward expansion. It promotes higher density land uses, encourages mixed-use zoning so that you actually have retail and commercial alongside homes, and it reduces the travel by private vehicles if at all possible. It revitalizes older areas, and particularly older urban areas that can start to create green cities, and it also preserves open space around the periphery. People around the country ask me, well, why do you promote smart growth in Massachusetts? Don't you already have it? There are village centers around with churches and clusters of homes. We have a coastline of beaches and fishing towns. We have a vibrant metropolitan area that attracts people from all over the country to work at our hospitals and go to our universities. And we have older industrial mill cities, which have once been real engines of economic growth in their regions. But here in Massachusetts, like every place else in the nation, we have our Anywhere USA, and we also have our Nowhere downtowns. And I thought I would just illustrate this by sharing a couple facts that really shocked me when I first moved to Massachusetts. We have particularly rapid growth on what I call the sprawl frontier in Massachusetts, which is the beltway between two of our major highways, the corridor between those highways, 128 and 495. And in this area, the population has increased, the increase in population in this area is actually about half of the total increase of population in Massachusetts. And the average lot size for a new home is 1.3 acres, which if you envision that is actually the size of a football field. Imagine every house that's built out there is on a football field. We're losing open space at about 2 acres per hour. So during this show, you're actually going to see a half an acre disappeared over the time period. And most of the reduction in open space is caused by the development of residential homes, 88% in fact. On the side of what about our downtowns and our nowhere downtowns, we really see a deepening divide between the haves and the have-nots. 80% of impoverished children live in the older cities and towns in Massachusetts, and 53% of the communities around the greater Boston area actually only permit the building of single-family units. So if you think about that, that's actually an act of discrimination because it's keeping people of lesser means out of the suburbs. 53% of the towns are not allowing people of lesser means into their communities. And lastly, we have longer and longer commutes, much like the rest of the country. If you look at California or Atlanta, you talk a lot about the traffic. We have it here also. And 1 out of 5 people here actually is spending more than an hour and a half in a round-trip commute every day. So you have urban disinvestment on one hand, and then you also have sprawling development at the periphery. This may appear like it's a result of consumer preferences, but I would argue that that has some merit, but not necessarily all merit. I would say that, in fact, some of these trends that we're seeing in Massachusetts, which are around the country, are the result of long-held public policies. At the local, state, and federal level since the 1950s, there's been subsidization of sprawl development. And actually, it's encouraged residential and commercial development at the very peripheries of our communities, which results in the Anywhere USAs. Our transportation investments are a prime example of this. Through the Federal Highway Act in the 1950s, we have development of highways that have just spread like a spider web throughout the Commonwealth. And as those highways developed, so did residential and commercial development. So these are things that we can change, the public policies. We have a very difficult road ahead of us to reverse some of those, and I'll talk about those in a minute. But one of the things that we can do, that is one area where we can control. The other area that's really has resulted in sprawl is about to change. And I would say that we are leaving the era of cheap energy. Cheap energy has made it possible for people to drive until they qualify and buy a home that they can afford around the 495 area or any other peripheral area of a metropolitan area. And I would say that as the cheap oil actually becomes more and more scarce and we are paying more and more to drive, that we are actually going to see more of an emphasis towards green cities, that consumer preferences are going to even more turn towards compact communities where people can walk and bike and get around by public transportation. I also just want to add a small addendum about consumer preferences because we hear all the time people want to live on a 2-acre lot with a large single home with 4,000 square feet and 5 bedrooms, but this isn't actually the case. A recent poll by the National Association of Realtors as well as Smart Growth America found that 6 out of 10 potential home buyers actually want to live in places where they can walk to retail, they can walk to their school, they can walk to their library, they have sidewalks, and they have short commutes. And they chose that option over sprawling development. So although you find a lot of people buying homes in the 128-495 corridor and even down on the South Shore of Massachusetts, it's not where people want to be necessarily. It's just where they can afford. And so people are driving to qualify for their mortgages. It's not necessarily their lifestyle of choice. So I would say in all of these areas, the public policies that we can start to change, the cheap energy, which is actually going to start forcing a change, and lastly, consumer preferences where people want a vibrant lifestyle in downtowns, actually provide quite an opportunity for promoting green cities and smart growth. And I want to just spend 1 minute before I conclude talking about what are some of the public policies that we actually do need to change, and what is the opportunity that we all have as residents in different states around the nation. One easy win-win for developers, for communities, and for consumers is to really promote urban redevelopment. And Peter mentioned transit-oriented development. Transit-oriented development is a concept where you orient residences, new homes, and retail around a transportation stop or a node. So we have many examples of this in the greater Boston area, where Harvard Square is one really great example, where you have people living nearby. They can walk, they can pick up their coffee in the morning, they can pick up a magazine, and it's all within really easy access for people. Transit-oriented development is one area. Another area is to clean up some of our older industrial, vacant, and abandoned properties, often referred to as brownfields. If we can clean up these contaminated sites, it prevents development from moving to greenfield sites that are more on the periphery of the metropolitan area. And there are many other incentives that we can actually offer to redevelop our urban cores and create green cities. A more politically tricky part of smart growth is looking at limiting development on the periphery and protecting areas of natural value. This is really tough because there are a lot of developers that they want to develop where they can develop, which is cheap land. And the cheap land is often on the periphery. It's easier for them to obtain that land. It's easier for them to get through the permitting process. It's easier because there's no community to protest that development. There's no NIMBYism, so-called, not in my backyard. So it's tougher to try to impose those limits. There are some places around the nation that have successfully done that, but it is quite a battle. I would say that one of the toughest issues that we face here in Massachusetts, and there are other places around the country, especially in New England, that face this, is that we are governed by municipality in terms of our land use. Most of the land use decisions that are made in Massachusetts are made at the municipal level. We don't have a strong county government. We don't have strong regional planning agencies. So when you look at these problems, which are regional in nature, where do the homes go versus where do the jobs go? We want to try to make them go close together. How are people commuting? What is the width and breadth of the commute shed? And how are our natural resources organized? Where are our watersheds? Where are our air basins, et cetera? All of these things are actually regional problems that municipalities municipalities are being asked to tackle on a town-by-town basis. It makes it very difficult for us to plan in a way that we can actually put homes and jobs close together, where we can actually protect overall watershed areas, and where we can make transportation a shorter commute for a lot of people and shorter trips. So these are some of the challenges that we face in our field. And they are very tough issues to tackle. They require us taking on things that are very politically unpopular. But I believe that the consequences of inaction on this are things that we will pay for many years to come, and our children will really inherit quite a large burden.
And now we'll hear from Larissa Brown. Larissa is a planner with Goody Clancy Associates, and she heads a sustainability effort for the Boston Society of Architects.
Thanks, Peter. I think a lot of the issues have been covered, so I won't, I'll just make a few remarks. I think that one of the things that's very interesting about the smart growth movement is that in many parts of the country it really emerged from the environmental movement and was for a long time associated with open space preservation and coming out of that ethos. What's interesting is that environmentalists then increasingly began to realize that perhaps one of the best ways to preserve habitat, to preserve open space, was in fact to promote urban development, reinvestment in cities, making cities better places to live, so people wanted to stay there rather than to continue to sprawl into what we call green fields. And in fact, one of my favorite quotations about smart growth comes from Henry Richmond, who was at one time the director of a group called the Thousand Friends of Oregon. And he said, when properly directed, development is not the problem, it is the solution. And I think that that's really the sort of the motto for our approach to smart growth here. So that the real issue is to balance growth, or what we might call growth infrastructure, with green infrastructure, and that's what we're really looking for in development trends and development patterns. Now, in many parts of the country, cities are coming back. We hear about that, even though there are certainly many cities where disinvestment and population decline remains a very serious problem. But certainly, here in our region, the city of Boston has gained population. It seems to, when people go into the city, it seems like a very thriving place. There's a lot of housing development. You see that in some other parts of the country as well. I think one of the things that has made that possible is investment in public spaces, what we call the public realm, making environments, urban environments, pleasant places to be. And creating more diversity in the types of housing and the housing that's available to people, making investments in mass transportation. And we see it, interestingly, in some of the cities in the South and the West, which did not have public transportation, good public transportation systems. Increasingly, people are voting to tax themselves or to support bonds to build new light rail systems, new transit systems, because they have really begun to experience the extreme consequences of sprawling growth. So there certainly is a movement back to the cities. You may have read, I think within the last year, there was actually an article in the New Yorker, calling New York the greenest city in America. And the point there was that the per capita energy costs in New York are smaller than elsewhere because it is such a dense community. So the city as an environmentally beneficial artifact, shall we say, of human culture is really something that's coming back. Now, what this means is that smart growth really does promote compact development, whether it's in cities like New York or in smaller kinds of communities. that has environmental benefits of many kinds. It saves resources, not just green space and habitat, but energy, as I mentioned, fewer dollars for infrastructure costs, which means that there's more public monies available for other kinds of purposes. It helps protect water quality because compactness also means that there's less impervious surfaces, meaning that there's less runoff pollution into water bodies. Obviously less traffic congestion, particularly if you have the benefits of public transportation, better air quality. But I think we also have to talk about, some of the challenges that we're facing in the new look of cities in our country. I mean, the population that's been coming back and the development that's coming back to the cities in the 1990s and the early part of this century has tended to be either younger adults or empty nesters. There's a real challenge in many communities of, what goes by the name of gentrification. And one of the big challenges that we do have is to figure out how can we preserve income diversity as well as racial and ethnic diversity in our cities. That's what cities have been historically. Cities are places where strangers meet, where you have the capacity to have the spontaneous connections with people who are not like you, and so that's something that's very important to retain in cities. And there are certainly some dynamics that make that harder rather than easier. Some of the other challenges, though they're being met a little bit better now than in the past. Brownfields redevelopment, the fact that many of our cities, especially the older cities that were home to industry, have contaminated sites which are costly to develop and redevelop, particularly if they're going to be used for housing. The whole question of how we provide a real range of jobs and good incomes to people. So, because what's also tended to happen is the city, as it has reemerged, successful cities tend to be entertainment and cultural centers, tourist centers, where the income distribution can tend to be one that's where you have jobs on one end that tend to be service jobs, not very well paid, and then on the other hand you have very well paid professional kinds of jobs. How do we find that middle ground? And related to that is the whole question of equalizing educational opportunity and school quality, because that's one of the reasons that you still see in many urban situations that middle class families, when they have children, will leave cities because they don't have confidence in urban public schools, and that's a reality that's a very serious problem. However, I think that there's a lot of reason to be optimistic about cities, to be optimistic about smart growth. One of the things that is very encouraging is that you start to see all over the country, not only in places that have a history of denser development, denser cities, but places in the southeast and the west. We're really beginning to see more attention to more compact development, better transportation choice. Even a place that's sort of the poster child for sprawl, like Atlanta, which was forced by necessity, really, because of air quality problems, to really pay attention to some of its transportation planning and, by extension, its land use planning. Atlanta is a place where also downtown is really changing. People are going back to the downtown. They're living there. There's a regional I wouldn't quite go so far as to say at a regional government, but sort of serious regional planning going on because of the transportation issues. So I think there are many things to be optimistic about, but there's still also many, many challenges that we need to consider when looking at the health of cities, making cities greener in the United States, and also making them work for everybody, not just certain parts of the population.
You're joining us at Cambridge Forum, listening to Peter Smith, Larissa Brown, and Kristina Egan discussing green cities. Peter, would you like to open the discussion?
Sure. This is a question for either or both of you. Proponents of smart growth have been pushing the positive, and we've been talking about the positive aspects of smart growth here tonight, all three of us. However, given the recent increase in gas prices, even though it was somewhat short-lived, and the long-term dwindling of the gas supply of fossil fuels in general, and the gradually likely increase in costs of those fuels, is it really an option for us to just say, well, in some cases we can have smart growth and compact development, or will it be really a requirement sometime soon?
Well, I think that actually we are going to be forced more and more into compact development, although many people want it anyway. So I think that the folks that are already kind of living in places where they can get to transit, where they can use zip cars, where they can walk and bike for a lot of their trips during the day, are not as hard hit by the gas prices. And you can start to see that people might make some different choices. Even if gas prices remain around $2 a gallon, just friends of mine who even aren't that engaged with smart growth issues or growth and development issues in general are starting to think about, well, where do they want to live? And I think that over time you'll start to see people looking at their pocketbooks. And one of the things that I thought was very interesting is we talk a lot about, well, how do we make sure that everybody, like Larissa said, that everybody is benefiting from growth, not just certain segments of the population. And people are going out to kind of far outlying areas in order to be able to buy a house. And I myself had a very difficult time finding a house near transit and in a downtown area because we just couldn't afford it on a nonprofit salary. But you start to see that people, especially lower income people, are spending about a third of their income on housing. And then also if they have to own a car, it can be another 25 to 27% of their disposable income is going to a car. And the average family in Massachusetts is spending about $6,000 a year on transportation. So if you up that with gas costs, I think that you're going to start seeing people making some different decisions because we're already paying a lot for transportation.
Could I just make a few comments on that? Not that I disagree with what Kristina is saying, but I think I don't like to present smart growth as a bitter pill that people have to swallow because we're facing terrible resource problems and that kind of thing. Although this is clearly a wider context of energy conservation that we have to think of. I think it's also important to look at smart growth and the kinds of communities that smart growth and development patterns produce as very good places to live, as places that are attractive, that are environmentally sound, that give people access to open space, to cultural activities, to jobs, that have a public realm that's a beautiful place to be, so that I think that I don't want us to live up to a kind of here on this panel to a kind of a New England stereotype that it's sort of we want to take the puritanical approach to these things and feel very good about ourselves because we're going to take this hard way out. I mean, I think smart growth is there is a pleasure principle in smart growth too, and it's a policy. It's a policy approach on a kind of a regional or state or a large geographic scale, but it's also a design approach on a more neighborhood or site scale about creating attractive, good, pleasant, beautiful places to live.
So there's really an aesthetic value to this shift in the way we're planning. I think people over the years have thought of cities as being dirty, dark places with high buildings and no sun. And the smart growth people and the green cities advocates, as we are, see them really as much better places to live than in other ways, because there can be less stress and you can have more free time. Would either of you have any comments on those ideas?
I would just say that I don't necessarily think it's the best way to live for everybody. For me, I like living in a suburb that has transit access so I can commute into the city for my job, but not everybody wants that. And I think that what we need to think about in terms of promoting smart growth in green cities is that we need to be able to offer choices to people about where they want to live and how they want to get around. And because of the history of investments and policies that our government has made on many levels, we don't have as many choices. And so a lot of people actually are forced, I'll use that word one more time, are forced to live in areas where they only can buy a house that is on a subdivision that's in 2 acres, and it's not their choice. It's just that's economically what they're able to do. So I guess I hesitate to put a value make it a value-laden discussion about, where's the best place to shop and where's the best place to live and what's the best kind of lifestyle, because I don't think it's about that. I think it's more about offering people the choices that they need in order to have the lifestyles that they really want to get on with.
I think also there is, we can take a historic perspective because, of course, the whole movement to suburban living that took place in the second half, particularly the second half of the 20th century, one can look at it in some ways as a reaction to the cities of the late 18th and early 19th century, the industrial cities, which were dirty, which were dark. I mean, the stories, if you read the novels about industrial London, one reason there was all that fog, it's all full of coal smoke and dust, and, they were not necessarily very pleasant places to live. And, they were disease-ridden. I mean, there were a lot of things that were, not so great about, especially for, the ordinary working person in the old industrial cities. And I think that we do now have, there are new technologies, there are new ways to build. We have new energy sources. Even, here in Boston, for example, buses now are increasingly compressed natural gas, so you don't have, big diesel clouds coming in your face when the bus goes by. So I think, the 21st century cities can, in fact, be much more pleasant places to live for everyone. And for some people, they choose and like very large, dense cities. Other people can be happier in more of a small town environment, but still where there's a certain amount of clustering, and that they have the opportunity to walk to some of their activities. So I think that there is a kind of a spectrum here that we're interested in promoting.
You're listening to Peter Smith, Larissa Brown, and Kristina Egan discussing green cities. Now we can take some questions from the audience. If you would come to the central microphone, and you can line up there even. While people are putting their thoughts together, I'll ask you a question. And I think I'll ask you, Larissa, because you brought up the historical perspective in the 19th century city. American cities are very, very much a product of a single person, and that is Frederick Law Olmsted, who had a vision of cities as democratic places that ought to be clean, with clean water and good public sanitation and open space. Is there anybody who has come along since Olmsted who has had that kind of an all-encompassing vision and has been able to persuade the powers that be, the municipal or regional authorities, to follow his plan for a better city?
Well, I think that there is no one who has the same stature as Frederick Law Olmsted, and I guess I would disagree a little bit with you that that all cities sort of, as we see them emerging from the 19th century, come from Olmsted, because of course there are cities in other parts of the country that have a very different model from the cities of the Northeast or the Midwest, where he primarily worked. I mean, for example, right now I'm doing work in the city of Miami, which of course grew up as a city of real estate speculation, and does not have the legacy, for example, of a large park system that places like not only Boston, but Buffalo or Minneapolis or Cincinnati has. So I would say at this point, I would agree with you. I don't see any single figure who has that kind of stature in terms of urban planning. And what we really are looking at now is much more a movement of people who have come together, often from somewhat different starting points, as I said, and some from an environmental starting point, some from a starting point of real lovers of city life, looking at ways to make cities work better, to bring back the old cities that have fallen into decay, and balance both what's old and bring something new as well to improve them.
Thank you. The audience? Yes, come.
Hi, my name is Elizabeth Klein, and I have two issues that I would enjoy hearing you talk about, and they have to do with green cities and smart growth. And they haven't really been dealt with yet in depth. One is education, and the other one is civic engagement. And as Larissa, you talked about bringing in more of the diversity, it definitely includes bringing the middle class back to some of the cities, and education seems to be key to that. So how does that fit in to you? And the civic engagement, to me, has to do with really respecting the variety of people. And so it's not the traditional participation, just allowing people to have a voice, but how do we really, in the evolution toward smart growth or sustainable communities or however you want to call it, how do we really create a different form? And Peter, I'm sure you're going to jump into this one too, so that people's perspectives, not just viewpoints, are really heard and brought into play.
Who wants to go first?
Why don't you go first, Peter?
Well, Elizabeth sort of pointed the civil engagement question, I think, to me, because a lot of my work over in this area has been in the public process area. And my perspective on that is that the design of cities has evolved, and that one of the driving forces has been the environmental movement that has been requiring environmental impact statements. Environmental impact statements, by definition, require civic engagement. When you're looking at a large project, a public works project, or even large development projects, large building development projects, developers are now required to not only hire consultants who generally will have integrity and will say yes or no to traffic impacts on existing neighborhoods or other environmental impacts, views and shadow studies and so forth, but also it really requires having a public dialogue, having the public really be involved in the discussion of those projects. Here in Boston, the Central Artery Tunnel project went through years of public meetings before it was able to move forward. And part of the results of that was that the requirements for the project to move forward required that there be public engagement throughout the design and construction process. And that's much more typical these days than it had been, say, 50 years ago, when the original elevated highway structure that cut through the city was originally built, where they tore down houses and they did it all really without any public input. But I think I think my colleagues might be able to comment on the education aspect of smart growth, which is really an important aspect, and also on civic engagement from your perspective.
I might just follow up
Sure.
the civic engagement portion, which is at the Massachusetts Smart Growth Alliance. We also see that not only at the project level is there a real need for citizens to get involved in figuring out what design of the project or the neighborhood is really going to benefit them best, but we also see that there's a framework of policy that has been in place for years, as I've talked about before, that needs to shift. And because the smart growth movement in many other parts of the country really evolved out of an environmental sentiment, that left out a lot of other people in the discussion. And so one of the things that I think what we've done successfully in Massachusetts is we've pulled together a coalition of folks that are actually looking at discrimination in the housing market, are looking at affordable housing for the low income and also the middle income, as well as environmental concerns, as well as municipal interests. What are the interests that municipalities have in terms of how they are governed and financed? And although we're not talking about kind of your person who is in a neighborhood being involved in these discussions, we are working with organizations that represent and work with communities to get a lot deeper into making an equitable smart growth movement so that we are actually addressing the needs of all residents and not just people that want to preserve open space in the suburbs.
Okay, I'll put in my 2 cents about civic engagement too. In my work as a planner, and also, as some of you here may know, I'm also on the Cambridge Planning Board. I have been involved in a number of contentious projects of various types. And I think that Peter is right that the planning community in general has tended in recent years to really try to develop better models of consensus building. I think it's also true that sometimes you can't always find 100% consensus. Generally, people want good things for their community as they understand it, but you can't always have 100% of every good thing. And so, to me, part of what has to happen in processes like this is that there has to be an initial discussion to sort of establish the values and the ultimate goals that people are looking for, and then try to develop out of that outcomes that can try to maximize those values. But it doesn't mean that that everybody is going to get everything that they want. And in some cases, you have a successful consensus when everybody around the table can just barely stand some parts of the final kind of package, but because they get some things that are very important to them, that they're willing to make that compromise. Education is clearly a very serious issue. Public education and disparities in public education. It's something that when people get together and talk about smart growth, there's always one moment when we all end up talking about it and thinking, oh my God, how can we also be experts in education and education funding and all the issues that go along with particularly urban educational issues. We have certainly tried from time to time to reach out to people who really are paying attention to those things. I think that on a very kind of simple-minded way to look at it, clearly one of the reasons that you have disparities in school quality, not the only reason, but certainly one of the reasons, it's funding disparities. And in some states, Massachusetts being one, there was more than a decade ago an effort to reform to some degree education funding, but it has not had as ideal effects as one would hope. There have been huge fights about these kinds of issues in other states like Vermont. particularly states like New England states where the property tax is such an important part of the school funding picture. So, it's not just about money, but on the other hand, I would argue you can't say it's not about money at all, and that when you look at some places that one could call, Vancouver, British Columbia, for example, is a real sort of poster child for smart growth. They decided a couple of decades ago to zone for and to encourage high-rise development in the center city. They have these slim towers on the waterfront, as well as other kinds of housing, and they have done a very good job in making that balance between high-density housing, having green fingers of parks going through the city, that kind of thing. And when you go there, you see a lot of families with children. And then when you inquire about how education is funded by the province of British Columbia. It's funded equally to everybody in the province. So you don't have a situation where city schools are very different from schools in other communities in the province. So we can't pretend to have all the answers to this, and I guess are hoping that as part of this greater movement of which smart growth is a part to really invest in our urban communities, that education becomes part of the picture even more than it is so far.
To just add to that, please come up. To add to that, we're in Massachusetts, we're in the process of trying to come up with a way of providing incentives for some of this smart growth housing in a law called Chapter 40R. And what we've done is analyze them and find that having education, having housing, because we have to have any housing that goes in has to be available to families with children, that cities and towns are resisting having compact housing because they have to pay for the education of any children out of the funding that they get. So our legislature is working on trying to provide ways of refunding cities and towns so that they can afford to pay for any children that move into these more compact developments.
My name is Jessie Grogan, and I have a two-part question about housing in the Boston area. First part is what is being done or should be done to encourage more development because there's such a major housing crisis. And second part is what is or should be being done to maintain some of the low-cost rentals and lower-end property that's being owned rather than just being converted into condos.
Okay, so your question has to do with what are we doing to get more housing because there's not enough housing in our metropolitan area generally, and what about rentals? How do we maintain rentals because in the Boston area more and more rental housing is being converted into condominiums?
You got it.
Who would like to tackle that? You want to talk about that?
Or do you want me to talk about it?
Well, I can talk a little bit about what's being done to encourage housing. I think people in general are really cognizant that we have an affordable housing crisis here in Massachusetts, and in the metropolitan Boston area, the average home price is about $400,000, which is out of the reach of many people. So your question is very timely, and I think at the legislative level, there has been some focus on Chapter 40R, the so-called smart growth overlay zoning, which would encourage cities and towns to put denser development housing in areas that are smart growth locations. So they're defining that as downtowns and near transit and maybe even other designated growth centers. How that will actually play out is yet to be seen. It's a new law. And so far, no communities have adopted it, and it's a little bit trickier in Boston because of the way that development is regulated here in Boston. But it could have some potential to at least incentivize cities and towns to accept more housing, which is Peter mentioned before, there's an awful lot of push against housing from cities and towns because they feel, whether rightly or wrongly, that it's going to cost them money when those school children move into those units. So I think there's some other ways, too, that the state has been engaged in trying to increase housing, and most of it has to do through funding programs for affordable housing. And there's always a push to try to make sure that there are some units that are designated as affordable in perpetuity, or at least for a 30-year period. And that money has been in danger, and at the federal level, Section 8 funding has been threatened. And so it is something that we have to keep our eye on to make sure that those rental units and the lower cost houses are still available on the market.
Yeah, I think one of the issues that's a very serious one everywhere is that for several decades, certainly federal housing policy, where a lot of the funding comes from, even if it's a pass-through to the states, has emphasized home ownership. And, you know, that's a great thing for those who can afford it. But there are certainly many people who either do not wish to own or cannot own, and perhaps never will be able to own housing. And that's particularly when we're looking at very low-income people. The housing subsidies for this group have been reduced. Generally speaking, you know, federal and state housing funding for affordable housing has been flat or declining in most programs. The solution in Massachusetts has been a program called, based on a law called Chapter 40B, which gives basically streamlined permitting for private development projects that get some subsidy and then don't have to pay attention to local zoning laws. And there actually have been quite a number of them that have been built in metropolitan Boston in the last couple of years, and a number of them are in fact rental properties, but they're only required to have 25% affordable, and also the affordability is usually at the level, I don't want to get too technical here, of 80% of the area median, which in a high-income region like ours means that a family of four that makes around $65,000 is eligible, for affordable housing. And if most of the affordable housing is kind of focused on that particular, the higher end of the affordable housing client market, it means it gets more and more difficult for people who really are very low income. And what we see, certainly what's happened in the Boston area, where there's been an affordable housing crisis now for many, many years, is that people who have, for example, Section 8 certificates end up going to other parts of the state where the housing market is much more affordable in some ways. But it means that they often get, they're completely taken out of the communities that they live in. They have to go find new jobs. I mean, it's a difficult thing. So there aren't easy answers to some of the things that you've been talking about, clearly.
My name's Richard Schultz, and I'd like to follow up on that with a question about land tenure. It seems to me, I live in a neighborhood where there's a lot of talk about transit-oriented development. I live near Ashmont Station in Dorchester. And so, I'm seeing visibly, low-income people moving out and three-deckers being gussied up and turned into condominiums. And the development hasn't even started. The improvements haven't even started, but just the talking. And now, certainly, in terms of public participation, I go to the community meetings, and the people who are being forced out, the low-income people, don't come to those meetings, and they don't understand this process. in the 60s, it was very visible. When the West End was knocked down by bulldozers, you could count the people. You knew who they were. Now it's the invisible hand of the marketplace that's doing this. So to wrap up, it seems to me, in terms of equity, there's sort of two sides to it. On the one hand, there's the lower income groups who get pushed out when the land is in the free market. And on the other hand, you get the people who are fortunate enough to own land and buildings in the areas surrounding these improvements get very often a very large increase in the value of their properties, which they really didn't earn through any effort of their own. And so I'm wondering if people are thinking, I know in Boston, the example people often point to as an attempt to address some of this is the Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative. And they've tried to address it by creating a community land trust. But even they're seeing that effort is falling far short in terms of the larger goal of having the people who lived in the neighborhood during the hard times being able to enjoy the benefits of their organizing and participating in that whole process. So the question is about land tenure.
Land tenure.
And equity.
Let me just reflect a little bit on that. You discussed the Dudley Square Initiative, which was a very remarkable program in that a community nonprofit, community-based CDC, was given permission actually to have eminent domain powers, which normally is only used either by state agencies here in New England or then is designated by state agencies to individual cities. But here was I think a unique case where a community group was given eminent domain powers to take vacant land and to designate it for affordable housing, and then they were able to build housing and keep that housing at an affordable level and build deed restrictions into the housing so that people who owned the housing, people who lived in the community, could be designated to be eligible for that housing. But they weren't able to then sell that housing at a premium with its actual value. They have to sell it at no more than whatever the normal inflation rate was for that building based on what they paid for it. But one thing that I wasn't aware of was that you're saying that that program fell far short of serving all of the people in that neighborhood. Was that that's your understanding?
Well, yes. The Dudley has two areas. They have their core area, and that right to eminent domain pertained to the core development area. But then their larger catchment area, as I understand it, includes something on the order of 27,000 people. And that surrounding area doesn't have any protection.
Yeah, so their program really was only for that limited neighborhood area, and they didn't have the authority to go beyond that. And you're right that in the inner city, what we call the inner city residential portions of Boston, in Dorchester and in Roxbury, there certainly is a need for affordable housing, and certainly the city has programs that are working on those issues, but it's not coming close yet to solving the problem. But I think it's important for our listeners to understand that there are ways and there are nonprofit groups that are working on affordable housing, as well as government agencies that are working on affordable housing, as we've discussed earlier. But it's not addressing enough of the issue so that it's still a crisis, as you've described.
Yeah, at the City Council, Boston City Council held hearings about the definition of affordability. And one of the issues they addressed was the change in the definition of median income. I think in Boston, the median income is somewhere around $36,000 to $40,000 for a family of four, and the federal government, as I understand it, changed the definition to include the suburbs, so that now the median income is around $80,000, $82,000. And so when you say affordable, as you indicated, you're talking about much higher income groups. And so folks were talking about the need to be clear about the economic group that it's affordable to, and not continue to use the global term affordable. And then the second point, and this is the point that the land trust people talk about, is the issue of permanent affordability. The programs, we continue to think in terms of short term, even as we're dealing with the loss of 10,000 or more affordable housing units in the Boston area that are these expiring use projects, where 20 years ago when they were set up, people thought 20 years was a long time. Well, 20 years has come, and now the owners, under the agreement made with the federal government, are allowed to say to people, you have to leave, I'm going to rent to an upper income group now. As long as land and housing is in the market, it gets turned over. And that's, it seems to me, is the underlying problem here. And well, I won't go on with that. I think.
Well, if I could maybe make a few comments about this. I mean, much of the work that we do when we work in neighborhoods is in. We've worked in a number of low-income neighborhoods in various parts of the country where precisely the problem is, on the one hand, you have an area where there's a lot of disinvestment, there's a lot of problems. Right now I'm working in a part of Baltimore where there are a lot of boarded up, row houses, all that kind of thing. You have people, homeowners who stayed there, and they too were low-income people and have really kept the neighborhood going. They want to see improvements. They'd be real happy to see their values go up, though maybe not so happy to see all the taxes go up. Yet at the same time, there's a very significant population of very low-income people in this particular neighborhood. For example, a lot of young single mothers with children. So how to create sort of sustainable mixed-income neighborhoods is really part of the big sort of planning challenge that we see in cities today. And given the realities of our current context in terms of where affordable housing funding comes from, and the level that it exists at, and the reality that we do live in a market context. I mean, I think that the most effective way to do it at this point is to have a combination of, you do need some investment for market rate housing, and to bring in new people into a neighborhood who have some higher incomes, can bring other kinds of investment with them. But then you also have to find a way to keep a significant percentage of the housing, as you say, permanently affordable, and there are a number of ways to do that, whether it's through land trusts or limited equity cooperatives or various kinds of or more traditional kinds of affordable housing. It's not. There isn't, the right perfect answer at this point, just given the world in which we live today, I think. But there are certainly, even in where you're talking about in Dorchester, not just Dudley Street, there are a number of CDCs that are working hard to try to create more affordability, including we've been working with 4 CDCs along the Fairmount line, looking at sites that could be transit-oriented sites with new stations. So this is a hard issue. It's a big issue in a lot of places around the country. Some other parts of the country aren't really affected so much by these the high housing costs that we see here. But it's something that's a very important part of smart growth thinking now, to think about affordable housing.
I would just add that I think it's also important to not only think about keeping units affordable in those communities, but it's also important to start thinking about providing economic opportunities for the residents that live there, so that you have job training programs in those areas. You make sure that more lucrative or even big box retailers don't push out the small businesses that are in the area. And in some places, there have been successful negotiated community benefit agreements with developers where the community has gotten together and said, you know what, we really want to make sure that if there is a, say, Dunkin' Donuts that goes in here, that we get a living wage for the people that live here that are going to work there. So once you have a living wage or you have higher income levels for those people, then it's easier for residents to remain in the community.
Rosalie Anders from Cambridge. I think all the stuff you're saying is great. And I also believe very much that it's wonderful to live in the city. Having said that, I'm reminded in the discussion of reading over the state's 20-year transportation plan that's on the table right now. And it has a lot of great stuff in there about pedestrian and bicycle access and transit-oriented development and so forth. And the goal of it really, and you know, they're trying to get away from doing a lot more, you know, increase in lane widths and stuff like that. But that's a 20-year plan. And what it's doing is trying to cut down on the rate of growth of vehicle traffic. It's not trying to reduce it. And it's kind of like they've said, no, we can't do that. I'm wearing the hat of climate change, global warming, and you know, the scientific consensus that we've really got to turn this around in the next 20 to 25 years. And, you know, sort of slowing down the rate of growth of global warming is not where it's at. So having agreed with everything you said about all the wonderful things we should be doing in the city, I wonder if you have thoughts about how do we move beyond that and really start thinking about what would be a sustainable community, you know, where our energy use, for example, might be 80% less than it is now. And just wondering what your thought, all of you, the thoughts you have on that.
You want to try that?
Sure. I think you're absolutely correct in looking at the 20-year transportation plan, that it's trying to slow the growth in the amount of miles that people are traveling, but not actually reduce the overall amount. This is a problem with just about every transportation plan I've ever looked at, because it is a very difficult thing to figure out how you're going to change the overall way that we organize ourselves to get around. I would say that some of the real policy prescriptions that I would see that would help with actually slowing VMT and reducing it are very politically unpopular at the moment. And I've always believed that at the heart of solving the transportation issues and congestion is to look at ways that you would price the different modes, taking different modes of transportation differently. In other words, I would say you make driving more expensive, you make parking more expensive, you make public transportation less expensive. And these are all things that are quite difficult. You can see people's reactions this summer when the gas price went up. They didn't want to pay that extra amount. And who can blame you? I wouldn't want to either. So it's a rational decision right now to drive your car. And if you look at the time cost of taking transit in many places, it actually just is not competitive with driving. It's much faster in a lot of places to drive. Now, when you have a very developed transit system, it makes it easier for people to get around. And in that case, it becomes competitive. But until you actually attack the way that our transportation modes are priced, we're probably not going to be able to address global climate change.
Well, I'm a proponent of wind power, and I think that can be, you know, that we have to look at alternative, you know, energy sources, whether it's, you know, solar or wind, or, you know, and we see small efforts in that in that area, though I understand that out in California, in the West Coast, there's actually much more wind power being produced and wind farms being built. So I think, it's part of the whole policy choices that have been made, because a lot of these things require, at least initially, some kind of subsidy or tax incentives, that kind of thing, to get people going. And now we may be entering a period where the cost of other forms of energy have become high enough that, in fact, there will be, a market benefit to going to the alternative forms before they become so, widespread enough, when theoretically, on a level of scale, they will also become less expensive. So, I understand your frustration. On the other hand, I also see the smart growth movement. In some ways, it's not a movement for purists. Incremental change is part of what we're about right now, because it's so hard to get even that incremental change sometimes. And so I think there's room for everyone who wants to work on these issues. In some ways, the people who want to work on climate change issues, I would see that, you have to be sort of more concentrated on that. And as I say, I think from a smart growth perspective, we all support, alternative energy, and would be part of smart growth. And certainly in terms of our organization, the Smart Growth Alliance in Massachusetts, we deliberately have created what we think of as a sort of a strange bedfellows alliance, because we wanted to break this polarity between, here are the open space people, and on the other side, here are the housing developers. And so by the same token, we're interested in having alliances with other, similarly minded groups in terms of supporting mutually supportive agendas. So.
I would only add, as an architect, that our buildings right now are very inefficient in terms of the way we use energy. And one of the statistics that I've heard that most people aren't aware of is that your electric bill in a commercial building, in a house, in any circumstance, typically 40 to 50% of your electric bill is as a result of is to pay for your lighting. And there really now are much more efficient lights that you can really reduce that energy use. And by reducing your electric energy use, you're also reducing the carbon that's used that goes up into the atmosphere and creates global warming. But furthermore, there are lots of other conservation steps that individuals can take in their own housing, and businesses can take when they build new buildings, and conservation measures they can take when they renovate existing buildings. And that would make a huge difference if everybody took those steps. Everybody used compact fluorescent light bulbs and took other significant steps to get energy audits from your utilities, and so you'd know what the priorities were, how many years it would take, 2 years or 3 years, to pay off the construction changes to your house. It would make a big difference in terms of your energy bill.
If I could just add one more thing, is that, levels of government can do something to promote this. And, for example, I feel proud of the fact that I was responsible for getting into the Cambridge zoning ordinance portion of our performance standards that asks developers to show us how they stand on the LEED environmental building standards. So, these are things that again, there's a way to sort of put some of these values into play in multiple ways.
I think everything you said is great. The one additional thing I'm curious about is that there are, for example, communities in Europe that have made a community-wide commitment to planning the community in a way that really, goes a long way towards sustainability. Communities in the Netherlands where everything that's built has to have a solar component, that sort of thing. So I think all the stuff you said is great in terms of what can be done building by building or, household by household. But what I'm wondering about, I guess, is what your thoughts are about taking that kind of community-wide approach here. And I mean, are we just too individualistic to ever do that? Or can you imagine a community like Cambridge, for example, moving in that direction where we'd really be making a community-wide commitment to whatever it is, solar, wind, that sort of really transforms the way our community functions?
Well, I think it's slowly happening in some ways. You do see in some communities, like here in our region, like Cambridge, like Brookline, where certainly in terms of the municipality's own expenditures, its own buildings, it's making the choice for more sustainable practices. That's getting more and more into becoming more of a part of review, development review, and all of these things sometimes take some time before they might become more permanent. And I think that depending on the context, because a place like Cambridge is very fortunate in that people want to come here. They want to live here. They want to invest here. They want to bring jobs here, so that we can be quite demanding, and we are quite demanding, and they will be happy to meet our requirements. It's not always so easy if you're in the Massachusetts context, a Springfield, or if you're a Columbus, Ohio, or cities that are in have many more challenges economically than we do. But I think that certainly this is something that you're seeing certain kinds of communities, and it's often university communities that have certain advantages that begin to do this kind of thing. So I think you're right. I mean, it is something that goes from the sort of individual level and then becomes more and more community level, but we're not Dutch yet. So.
But we have seen across the country cities who have taken stands and said that we're going to reduce our energy to by this percentage over time, and we're going to take this stand both for municipal buildings and then we're going to review buildings. The City of Boston has put in new guidelines for any new building that comes before it from developers, that they're going to be requiring them to come up to the plate, just as they do for the percentage of affordable housing. There are many cities and towns across the state of Massachusetts, as there are in other states, where there's a certain percentage of affordable housing required by each developer over a certain number of a developer that comes in with a certain size development. And the same thing is beginning to be true of energy requirements.
I want to ask you all to contribute to the answer to one last question. If you could describe, as you describe creating a green city from a brown city or a smog-laden city, sounds a whole lot like changing the flywheel while the car is running. But if you could describe some of the features of a contemporary green city, what features would you put into them? Would you start the list, Larissa?
Well, I think what you would need is to have compact development, but that's balanced with a very robust system of parks, open spaces, and sort of environmentally sensitive approach to waterways and to other kinds of environmental systems within the city. So that you want to have a city that on the one hand provides a tremendous public realm for the people who live there, so that even if you live in a smaller space, there are wonderful places to go in where you can, which you can enjoy with other members of the public, and but it's also a city that is ecologically healthier than cities have traditionally been.
And what would you add?
I'll add the transportation component, where I think that if all cities were able to have sidewalks and bike lanes and narrower streets so that people weren't intimidated to use the sidewalks and bikeways, that would be a good start. And I think also if we were able to make sure that every child could walk to school or bike to school, you'd start to see a city that was designed for our children and our elders, which is ultimately designed for everybody.
And finally, Peter, what would you put into this ideal green city?
Well, if I were to envision the ideal city, it would be in a time when the federal government had entirely different priorities than we currently do. So there would be billions of dollars available, and all urban schools would have very high quality education. Teachers would be paid the equivalent of doctors, and we would therefore have a flood of excellent teachers. We would have arts programs so that all cities would have sculpture wherever you walked, so that it would be a delight to be in those compact urban areas. We would have, of course, lots of open space. We would turn brownfields into open space and play fields so that people would be attracted to the compact, dense urban areas. And then all the other things that my colleagues have of course suggested would happen. But that would be my dream of where we would go, that we would shift our priorities so that the quality of life in all of the United States would be quite different, because the federal monies would be there. It wouldn't take that much of a shift to make these things happen.
Okay, thank you for that picture of the green city. Thank you, Peter Smith, Larissa Brown, and Kristina Egan. You've been listening to a program of Cambridge Forum recorded in November 2005, co-sponsored by the First Parish in Cambridge, Unitarian Universalist, the Lowell Institute, and the Friends of Cambridge Forum. For more information about this radio program entitled Green Cities, featuring Peter Smith, Larissa Brown, and Kristina Egan, or about our ongoing radio series, visit us on the web at cambridgeforum.org. In Harvard Square, I'm Pat Zerke. Thanks for joining us.